You know, with the tragedies and all the violence that's all around us, it's understandable that some people would have some lack of faith and would raise questions like the prophets in the Old Testament who felt sometimes abandoned by God, and they would oftentimes say, "How long, O God, before we hear your answer?" And we can say that now. How long, O God? What is happening to us? Well, I suppose that we all have questions about our faith sometimes in our lives, and we wonder if we have enough faith. And like those who ask Jesus to increase their faith, I hear people say, "Do I have enough faith? How can I get more faith?" So this morning I want to talk just a little bit about that subject of enough faith. And the angle from which we look at things makes a big difference. An English Lord Chesterfield one time pointed out that a horse looks pretty much like a horse from the ground level. But then when you get into the loft, and I don't know how he gets this, but he says when you get into the loft and you look down, it no longer looks like a horse, but it looks like a violin. Well, you see, it's just your perspective that makes the difference. And it's not unusual in the Gospels for the same story to be told by two different authors from two different perspectives, and it sounds the same, but it also sounds different because of their perspective. For example, in Matthew's Gospel, we read about the time that the disciples failed in their attempt to try to heal an epileptic youth. And then when they asked Jesus why they had failed, he said it was lack of faith. Then he said, "If you have the faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible to you." Now that's the kind of faith I'd like to have, to move mountains. Now compare that story to the one in Luke that Abel read this morning. The disciples made a request of Jesus. Increase our faith. And we can sympathize with that request. Who has not cried out in some time in their life, like the man in the Scriptures who said, "I believe, help thou my unbelief." Or sometimes the more I believe, the less I believe, or the more I doubt my belief. If you had faith, just as a grain of mustard seed, you would say to the mulberry tree, "Move," and it would go out into the sea. Notice how similar those words are in Luke to the ones that are used in Matthew. You see, this time, Jesus launches into the discourse on the importance of being an obedient servant. In other words, he seems to be saying to the disciples that their problem is not lack of faith. Just a tiny bit of faith will work wonders. Their problem is lack of action. If they're going to do what they ought to be doing, they would see the results that they are seeking. See the difference in emphasis? In Luke's account, Jesus is saying to us that it's deadly to sit around twiddling our thumbs trying to find out if we have more faith and asking that more faith be given to us. What we need is to start doing what we ought to be doing, and then we can watch our faith grow. St. Paul was undoubtedly the most committed follower of Jesus Christ who ever lived. Still, he didn't have enough faith to have that thorn that was put in his flesh removed. But God did give him the ability to endure once the thorn was in the flesh. You see, both faith and grace are free gifts, and they're free gifts from God. So the problem is not our lack of faith. God has given us all the faith in the world that we need. It's just like peace. Sometimes we pray for peace. We don't need to pray for peace. Jesus said, "My peace I give to you, my peace I leave with you." He has given us plenty of peace. What we need to pray for is to claim the peace that Jesus has given to us. Same with faith. He's given us all the faith we'll ever need. We just need to claim that faith. And that brings me to something else that I think needs to be said with this scripture. And I think it's the nature of faith in itself to expand to fit our needs. And the more we do of the things we ought to do, the greater our faith becomes. You know, faith is not something that we earn. It comes strictly from God. And God can always be trusted to give us any extra amount of faith that we may need. It's up to us to claim that faith, but more importantly, to put it to use. John D. Rockefeller was one of the richest people who has ever lived. There is probably nothing of material value in this world that Rockefeller could not have given to his children. Do you know, however, that he had a daughter who became obsessed with the fear that she was going to die penniless? Her years were haunted with that fear that she would die penniless and would be totally destitute. Can you imagine such a thing? A Rockefeller worried about running out of money? Can you imagine a child of God worried sick that he or she would go to the well for spiritual resources of God and find the well run dry? If you are like me, there may be some times in which you have wondered, when you've doubted if God heard you, or if he was really going to answer your call for help this time. But we really know at some level that God's resources are inexhaustible. You know, there are people and there are churches who don't venture out into great works because they fear they will fail. It's as if they think that God will let them down even when they are attempting to do God's work. You see, it is not our lack of faith so much as that we do not put our faith into action. We seem to vary between two extremes. And some of us can experience the fear or the paralysis of analysis. We can analyze something so long we don't get anything done, and we don't put our faith into action until God gives us some sign that He is real, that He is in control. We remain immobile. There are times when I think the church is guilty of that. We don't attempt, and I'm talking about this church now, we don't attempt new ministries of outreach very easily because a number of excuses, but they all boil down to either believing that God will not see us through to success, or that we don't want to take the actions that are necessary because our efforts may require too much from us. We don't really need an increase of faith. We need to increase our action, and then we'll see our faith grow. When we help others to do things better and help others to achieve a better life, somehow we feel better. Sometimes don't just do something, sit there. Seems to be our creed. It is amazing how truly passive Christians are in this world. As a rule, about 80% of our population in any community will not roll out of bed on the average Sunday to either go to church or find some spiritual outlet. Most are decent, abiding, law-abiding folks who claim to believe in God, but nobody's going to accuse them of being spiritual workaholics either. This does not mean that I say you have to be in church every Sunday in order to be considered a Christian or to live a spiritual life. But it seems to me, those who are in church develop a greater sense of spiritual well-being, spiritual needs, and gifts than those who stay at home and read the Sunday paper or watch their favorite talk show. There are many ways of expressing our faith and love in God. An October 5th, 1988 issue of the Christian Century carried a story of a couple who found a way to enjoy life and a better way to express their faith. Millard Fuller was a successful lawyer, but he was dissatisfied. He had it all, and yet he decided he really didn't have anything. So he and his wife walked out of that successful law practice. They sold everything, got rid of all of their money, gave it to the charities, and he went to Georgia and joined Clarence Jordan at the Colonia Christian community outside Americus, Georgia. And along with other Christians in the community, they searched for a focus for their lives that would have meaning. And think of that. Search for a focus for their lives that would give their lives meaning. Eventually, they established an organization that today is called Habitat for Humanity. Most of us are probably all familiar with that great organization and the good that it does around the country, and indeed, yes, right here in the valley. The wonderful idea is simply, in Millard Fuller's words, that all God's people ought to have a decent, affordable housing. So they work along with others, find some poor, decent folk who are willing to work to better their situations, and they work along with them to build a simple, decent house to live in. And when they're done, these folk have a house at a cost that is affordable. Habitat for Humanity is having a remarkable impact all over this country and in some countries beyond, because some people found a better way to live, to help others. It's miraculous how homes have changed as a result of these people. We know that teenage pregnancies are considerably reduced in the population in Habitat for Humanity communities where people have home ownership. We know that unemployment is less in Habitat communities than comparable areas. We know that all types of crime are considerably reduced. The simple act of people acting out their faith and making others' lives better has given meaning to their lives. I have a dream. I have a dream that our church will engage in some activity or some activities that will make the lives more meaningful for all of us as well as for all of those that we serve. It doesn't have to be any, one or all of the 34 suggestions for outreach ministries that I've given to you several times. But how wonderful it would be, how wonderful it would be if we would come together and we would develop even one more meaningful ministry that would not only help others, but could be a signature ministry of this church, but it would also make our faith more active and more meaningful. That we could find a ministry that says all of God's people ought to have ... and we fill in the dots as a ministry. All of God's people ought to have this, and by golly, we're going to help see it happen. That is putting our faith into action. You see, the problem is not our lack of faith. The problem is our lack of action. We need to give feet to our convictions. Then we will see miracles galore. When we see and understand this principle, some words of Albert Schweitzer years ago will make sense. Schweitzer spoke to the graduating class in an English boys' school back in 1935, and he said, "I do not know what your destiny will be. Some of you perhaps occupy remarkable positions. Perhaps some of you will become famous for the pen or as artists. But I know only one thing. The only ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found a way to serve." These are true words. To find and to serve. One of the things that has made Rotary International so strong for so many years around the world is that their motto is service above self. And they proclaim, he who serves most serves best. When I'm having difficulties in my life, and I call somebody for advice, I have my spiritual guru that I call frequently, that I can get on a pity pot with and cry to. And he always tells me the same solution. I know what he's going to say before I call him. Go out and find somebody to help. Get out of yourself. Find somebody that you can be of service to. And you know what happens when you do that? Somehow you feel better when you've helped somebody else to be better. See, the problem is not lack of faith. The problem is lack of action. There's a new dimension, I hope, that you can see from Jesus' teaching about having the faith the size of a grain of mustard seed. It doesn't take a lot of faith to perform miracles. Even the tiniest bit of faith will do. What really matters is that we put that faith to work. Later, if we still need more faith, God will give it to us. When we commit our lives in service to God and humanity, we see our faith grow from a tiny seed to an enormous tree. And we can see miracles that we have never expected to see. Increase our faith, said the disciples. Increase your service, said Jesus. You will find faith that you never knew that you had. Do you hear him this morning? I hope so. Amen.